Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving right into a seriously fascinating piece of history, François Maximilien Misson's 17th-century eyewitness travelogue, A New Voyage to Italy. Now, this isn't just your average run-of-the-mill diary. It's actually a profound historical lens that gives us a rare, unvarnished look at the realities of the Jewish diaspora in early modern Europe. We're going to see exactly how Misson's first-hand accounts serve as crucial, undeniable evidence of the Black Hebrew lineage in 17th-century Europe. We'll explore everything from physical characteristics and immense wealth to brutal oppression, and see how these historical forces literally shaped everything from global maritime trade to the actual food people had to eat to survive. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Complexion and the vulgar error. 2. Wealth in the Venetian Ghetto. 3. Roman oppression under Paul IV. 4. Hardships and dietary realities. 5. Biblical roots in Isaac. And 6. Misson's definitive distinction. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Complexion and the Vulgar Error, correcting 17th century stereotypes. So I really want you to notice the specific language Misson uses here. In his travelogue, he explicitly calls out what he describes as a vulgar error, basically a massive misconception held by many white Europeans at the time who just assumed that all Jews were black. Misson sets the record straight. He clarifies that this dark complexion is actually a specific, distinct trait of the Portuguese Jews. Because this community practiced endogamy, meaning they married strictly within their own group, they passed these swarthy physical characteristics down through the generations. This right here is a massive piece of documentary evidence regarding the presence of a Black Hebrew lineage in 17th century Europe. And he brilliantly illustrates this point by drawing a hard demographic contrast. On one hand, you have the Portuguese or Sephardic Jews, whose swarthy complexion was, as he says, entailed upon their whole race due to those isolated marriage practices. On the other hand, he compares them to the German Jews he observed firsthand over in Prague. He completely notes that these Ashkenazi Jews were, quote, no blacker than the rest of their countrymen. So Misson is essentially drawing a definitive line in the sand between the black Portuguese Jews and the lighter European Jews of Germany, purely based on what he saw with his own two eyes. Moving right along to Section 2, Wealth in the Venetian Ghetto, Maritime Success in Italy. You know, the Venetian Ghetto definitely wasn't a monolith. It was a highly structured, complex, and strictly divided society. In the Ghetto Vecchio, you had the Ponentini, the Westerners from Portugal and Spain, living alongside the Levantini from the east. Meanwhile, the Ashkenazi from Germany and Eastern Europe were placed over in the Ghetto Nuovo. The huge takeaway here is that the Portuguese and Spanish Jews were deeply embedded in some incredibly lucrative trade, which gave them a seriously elevated status within this segregated system. To put it simply, these Portuguese exiles were a major economic engine. They leveraged their vast global connections, especially with the Ottoman Empire, to drive what was called a great trade. They didn't just scrape by in Venice, they achieved absolute economic dominance. And that immense wealth funded a literal cultural renaissance within the ghetto walls, supporting rabbis, doctors, and philosophers. Out of all the foreign Jews living in the Republic of Venice at that time, the exiled Portuguese were without a doubt the most prosperous. But things were very different elsewhere, which brings us to Section 3, Roman oppression under Paul IV, a drastic reversal of fortune. Let's follow this grim timeline of systemic oppression. Before Pope Paul IV came to power, Jews in Rome actually enjoyed some level of liberty, but that vanished overnight. In 1555, Pope Paul IV issued a bull called Cum Nimis Absurdum, which roughly translates to, because it is absurd. This ruthless decree systematically stripped away their liberties. They were forcibly confined to the Roman ghetto, shoved into a single cramped corner of the city. To publicly humiliate them, they were forced to wear yellow hats. And by 1566, things escalated drastically when the Pope ordered all Portuguese Jews in Ancona to be arrested and treated like common criminals. This image here powerfully captures the absolute terror of that era. The oppression wasn't just some administrative red tape, it was brutal, physical violence. We're talking forced evictions and terrifying autos de fe, which were public burnings at the stake. In Ancona alone, following those arrests, dozens of people were imprisoned and burned. It was an era entirely calculated to crush the spirit of the community. This leads us right into Section 4, Hardships and Dietary Realities. Life inside the Roman ghetto. Misson's accounts go into detail about how deliberately this community was impoverished. By literal papal law, they were forced to liquidate their properties and land. Socially, they were entirely cut off, explicitly forbidden from even talking to or eating with Christians. Economically, their livelihoods were strangled. They were only allowed to trade in second-hand goods, or as Misson puts it, old clothes. It is a stark, horrifying contrast to the incredibly wealthy maritime merchants we just looked at in Venice. And this extreme poverty impacted literally every facet of life, right down to their diet. We actually have this fascinating, if a bit grim, documentation from an observer named Dean Wren. Because the community strictly observed the religious prohibition against eating blood, preparing meat in these unsanitary, cramped ghetto conditions was incredibly difficult. Wren noted that they kept their meat covered in thick layers of onions and garlic until it essentially putrefied, just trying to mask the smell and taste of the aging meat. It is such a vivid sensory detail of what survival looked like under extreme duress. So how did they survive this? Let's look at Section 5, Biblical Roots in Isaac, the Theology of Resilience. The biblical story of Isaac's willing sacrifice in Genesis 22 became a vital psychological framework for them. In Jewish exegesis, these historical persecutions, the ghettos, the yellow hats, the burnings, they weren't viewed as just senseless victimhood. Instead, they were seen as yusurin shel ahava, or chastisements of love from God. Just as Isaac was willing to offer his life as a supreme test of faith, the community framed their own suffering as a profound, enduring test of their faithfulness. It was this exact theology that galvanized their resilience against incredibly hostile European powers, rather than breaking their spirit. And finally, Section 6, Misson's Definitive Distinction, the Legacy of the Diaspora. Ultimately, Misson's travelogue serves as an incredibly important historical artifact. He didn't just observe, he drew a definitive line, impartially recording the specific physical and cultural distinctions of the endogamous Portuguese Jews. By correcting that vulgar error of his time, he identified the dark-complexioned Portuguese Jews as a wholly distinct branch, totally separate from the lighter populations of Northern Europe. He is essentially identifying them as the branch of the diaspora that historical context tells us was heavily tied to the populations later deported to West Africa and the Americas. Which leaves us with a pretty profound thought to ponder today. When we look at all these documents, from the immense wealth of Venice to the oppressive, crushing ghettos of Rome, from physical descriptions to sheer dietary survival tactics, we see a people in constant flux. As populations are forced to migrate, as they face extreme isolation and adapt just to survive, we really have to ask ourselves, how will these powerful historical forces continue to endlessly reshape human identity, physical demographics, and the very boundaries of who we are? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.